It was a quiet afternoon on Maple Street. The sun shone down from a clear blue sky, casting warm light over the neighborhood. A police officer, Officer Daniels, sat in his car, parked at the side of the street. His eyes scanned the road, looking for anything out of the ordinary. He'd been on the force for over 10 years, and nothing surprised him anymore. But today, something caught his attention. A man was walking slowly down the street, his shoulders hunched, his face covered with a thick beard that looked like it hadn't been shaved in weeks. His clothes were old and worn, a jacket too big for his body and jeans that looked like they had seen better days. The man's steps were heavy, like he was carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. Officer Daniels watched him for a moment, his hand resting on the steering wheel. There was nothing obviously wrong with the man, but there was something about him that didn't sit right. Officer Daniels had been trained to notice the smallest details. His instincts told him that this man didn't belong here. Maybe it was the way he was walking, or the way he seemed to avoid eye contact with anyone around him. Whatever it was, Daniels knew he needed to stop him and check things out. It was just another part of the job. He started the engine and pulled out from his spot, driving slowly behind the man. He kept a careful distance, watching him as he walked past the small grocery store, his eyes fixed on the sidewalk. As the officer got closer, he decided it was time to make his move. "Excuse me, sir," Officer Daniels called out, rolling down his window. The man didn't respond at first. He kept walking, as if he hadn't heard. But Officer Daniels wasn't going to let that slide. He pressed the siren lightly, just enough to get the man's attention. The man froze. He didn't turn around at first, but after a long moment, he slowly pivoted. The officer noticed that the man's face looked tired, worn down by life, and it showed in his eyes. There was a kind of sadness there, the kind of sadness you can't fake. It was the kind of look that made Officer Daniels feel uncomfortable, but he quickly pushed that feeling away. "Is there a problem, officer?" the man asked, his voice rough, like he hadn't used it in a while. "You were walking kind of slowly. Just wanted to make sure everything was okay," Officer Daniels replied, his hand still resting on the door handle. He had his reasons for stopping the man. It wasn't the first time he had pulled someone over who didn't seem to belong. He needed to do his job, but something told him this wasn't going to be a normal stop. The man didn't seem to mind the questioning. In fact, he looked almost relieved to talk to someone. His shoulders relaxed, just a little, and he met the officer's gaze. "I'm fine, officer. Just taking a walk. Been a long time since I've been out here." Officer Daniels raised an eyebrow. "A long time," he repeated, his curiosity piqued. "Yeah," the man said quietly. "Long time since I've been in the world outside. Things change, you know." There was a pause. Officer Daniels didn't say anything right away. Instead, he studied the man closely. Something about the way he spoke made Daniels think that there was more to the story. It wasn't just the man's appearance that seemed off. It was his words. They didn't fit with the usual story of someone just walking down the street. "Well," the officer said, still watching him, "I'm gonna need to see your ID, sir." The man sighed deeply, almost like he had expected this moment to come. He reached into his jacket pocket slowly, pulled out a worn wallet, and handed over a faded ID. Officer Daniels glanced at the name. John Turner. The photo on the card was old, the edges of the picture curled from age. But it was enough. The officer looked back at the man, his hand still holding the ID. "John Turner," Officer Daniels said, reading the name out loud. "You've been in town long?" The man didn't answer right away. His eyes dropped to the ground, and for a moment, Officer Daniels thought he wouldn't speak. But then, with a deep sigh, John looked up again. "I used to live here, long ago," he said softly. "A different life back then." The officer felt something shift in the air. There was a quiet heaviness to the man's words, and for the first time, Daniels wondered if there was more to this man's story than he could imagine. Officer Daniels looked down at the faded ID in his hand. Something about the man named John Turner seemed different now. The way he spoke, the look in his eyes, it wasn't the same as the usual people he stopped on the street. He had to know more. "Where've you been, Mr. Turner?" Officer Daniels asked, still holding the ID, his voice softer now. "You don't look like someone who's just been walking around." John shifted his weight from one foot to the other, as if he was thinking about how to answer. His eyes stayed on the ground for a moment, and the officer noticed how deep the lines in his face were. It was clear this man had seen a lot in his life. "I've been around," John replied quietly. His voice was rough, but it wasn't because of anger. It was more like he was carrying something heavy that he couldn't put down. "But not in the way you think." Officer Daniels frowned, his curiosity growing. "What do you mean?" John finally looked up, meeting the officer's gaze. There was a sadness in his eyes, something that went beyond the rough exterior of an old man. He looked like someone who had lived through things most people couldn't even imagine. "I served in the army," John said, his voice low. "A long time ago." The officer raised an eyebrow. "Army? You mean you were a soldier?" John nodded slowly, and for the first time, Officer Daniels saw the weight of the words in his eyes. "I was a soldier. I fought in places that most people don't even know exist. Fought for this country, fought for people like you." His voice cracked slightly as he spoke, and Officer Daniels took a step back, realizing he wasn't talking to just any man. He was talking to a veteran, someone who had fought for everything Officer Daniels sometimes took for granted. John turned his head slightly, like he was looking into the past. "I've been to places, seen things that no one should ever have to see. Some of my friends didn't come back. I never thought I would either." Officer Daniels stood still, trying to process what the man was saying. "Where did you serve?" John paused for a long moment before speaking again. "Afghanistan, Iraq, places where the fighting never stops. Some missions we couldn't even tell people about. And sometimes we lost men. Good men. They didn't make it out." The officer felt his throat tighten as John continued. "I came back, but not really. The war, it stays with you. It doesn't leave, not really. You carry it inside, in your heart and in your mind. You wake up at night, and the faces of the men you lost are still there. You hear the screams, the sounds of the explosions. It doesn't go away. And when you try to talk about it, people don't want to hear it. They don't understand." John's voice dropped to a whisper as he spoke those last words, almost like he was talking to himself. The officer was shocked by how much pain was behind his words. He had heard stories about soldiers, but hearing it directly from someone who had lived through it was something else. "I tried to come back to normal life," John said, his eyes looking off into the distance. "But how can you come back to something that isn't there anymore? How can you pretend everything's fine when you know it's not?" Officer Daniels felt a lump form in his throat. He had never thought much about what soldiers went through, not really. He had always seen them as heroes, but now, hearing John's words, he understood that there was so much more to the story. They weren't just soldiers. They were people who had given pieces of themselves to a cause, and sometimes those pieces never came back. "I tried to find a job, get back on my feet," John continued. "But it's not easy when you're broken inside. I lost my family, lost my friends. The world just moved on without me." The officer didn't know what to say. He had never imagined that someone like John, someone who had served and sacrificed so much, would be left to feel so forgotten. He stood there, unable to speak, as John's words hung in the air. John turned his gaze back to the officer. "I didn't ask for this life. I didn't ask to be a hero. I just did my job, like I was told. But when I came back, no one cared. No one even noticed." For a long moment, the street was quiet. Officer Daniels felt his entire perspective shift. This wasn't just a man walking down the street. This was a man who had given everything for his country, only to come home to a world that didn't seem to care. The officer's hands trembled slightly as he held the ID, no longer feeling like the one in control of the situation. John stood there, waiting for a response. But the officer didn't know what to say. What could he say to someone who had already given so much? Officer Daniels stood there, unsure of what to say. He felt like he had just heard a story that went far beyond anything he could have imagined. John Turner, the man he had stopped just moments ago, wasn't just another person on the street. He was a man who had seen war, lost friends, and fought battles that would never leave him. John seemed to sense the officer's confusion. His eyes softened a little as he watched Officer Daniels struggle to find words. He wasn't angry, but there was a quiet sadness in him that spoke louder than any words could. For a moment, the officer wasn't sure if John was trying to help him understand, or if he was simply looking for someone who would listen. "It's not just the battles, officer," John said slowly, as if he was trying to make the officer understand something that words couldn't fully explain. "It's what happens when you come home." Officer Daniels blinked, trying to process what John meant. He was used to hearing about soldiers returning from war, but he had never thought about what happened after. The flag ceremonies, the thank yous, the medals, those were the things people saw. But John wasn't talking about that. He was talking about the dark, painful truth that many veterans faced, things that no one ever saw. "When I came back," John continued, "the war didn't end. It didn't just stay back there. It came home with me, right here," he said, tapping his temple with one finger. "The worst part of fighting is that the battle never really ends. It keeps going. In your head. In your heart." Officer Daniels listened carefully, his heart sinking as he realized just how deep the pain went. He had never considered that a soldier's battle might continue long after the war itself was over. "You think you can come home, pick up where you left off," John went on, his voice shaking slightly. "But you can't. You're not the same person you were. You're changed. You're broken in ways people don't understand. I tried to go back to my old life. I tried to be the man I was before. But the truth is, that man doesn't exist anymore." The officer's chest tightened. He had always thought that once soldiers came home, everything would return to normal. But John was telling him that wasn't the case. There was no going back. There were scars that no one could see, things that the world could never understand. "I remember the first night I got home," John said, his eyes growing distant. "I thought everything would be fine. I thought I would feel happy, be relieved. But I didn't feel anything. All I felt was empty. It was like a piece of me had been left behind out there, in the desert, in the mountains. And when I came back, I couldn't fill that hole." Officer Daniels felt a lump in his throat. He had never experienced anything like what John was describing. He had never known what it was like to have a piece of himself taken away and never return. John took a deep breath, his eyes meeting the officer's. "You try to talk about it, try to explain what you've been through, but people don't get it. They don't know what it's like to wake up in the middle of the night, sweating and screaming, thinking you're still in a war. They don't know what it's like to walk down the street and see shadows that remind you of the ones you lost." There was a long silence. Officer Daniels didn't know what to say. He couldn't even imagine what it must have been like for John, to live with those memories every single day, never getting a break from the pain. "I wasn't ready for what I came home to," John said, his voice quiet now. "I wasn't ready to be alone. And I wasn't ready for the world to forget about me." The officer's heart ached. John wasn't just talking about physical scars. He was talking about the mental and emotional battles that soldiers fought long after the fighting ended. He was talking about the isolation, the feeling that no one cared or understood. "I lost everything," John whispered. "My family, my friends, the people I used to know, they were all gone. And I didn't know how to get it all back. I didn't know how to fix myself." Officer Daniels was speechless. He had no idea how to help this man who had been through so much. But something inside him told him that listening, just listening, was the best thing he could do right now. John glanced up at him, his eyes still heavy with the weight of everything he had been through. "So, yeah, officer," he said softly. "The battles don't end. They just change. And sometimes they're harder to fight than the ones you faced on the battlefield." Officer Daniels stood there in silence, feeling the full weight of John's words. The man wasn't just a soldier. He was a human being who had been through hell and was still fighting every day to survive. And now, for the first time, the officer understood that the war didn't end when the fighting stopped. It never really ended at all. Officer Daniels stood still, his eyes locked on John Turner. Every word the man spoke seemed to sink deeper into his mind, making him rethink everything he had ever known about soldiers, about war, and about the world outside his own small bubble. John's words echoed in his head, making him feel like he had missed something important all these years, something that no one had ever talked about. John had just told him about the silent battles he fought every day, the ones that couldn't be seen. He had talked about the darkness inside him, the loneliness, and the nightmares that haunted him. Officer Daniels had always respected soldiers, but now, standing face to face with one, he felt a deep uncertainty that he couldn't shake. The officer's hand gripped the door of his patrol car, his fingers tightening. For the first time in his career, he questioned what he was doing. Was he doing the right thing? Was it right to stop John in the first place? The man had been walking down the street, minding his own business, yet here he was, standing in front of a police officer, explaining the pain of a war that had taken so much from him. "What happens now?" Officer Daniels asked, his voice lower than usual. John didn't respond right away. His eyes drifted toward the street, as if he was looking for something, anything, to distract him from the weight of the conversation. Finally, he spoke, his voice softer this time, like he was speaking to himself more than to the officer. "Most people don't care, about what we go through when we come back. They don't see the damage, the scars on the inside. They don't see the nights when you can't sleep, or the mornings when you don't want to get out of bed. They just want to forget about you, like you're a part of a past that doesn't matter anymore." Officer Daniels felt a lump in his throat. He had always seen veterans as brave heroes, people who fought for their country. But now, after hearing John's story, he realized that there was so much more to it. The war didn't end when the fighting stopped. For men like John, it kept going, and the world around them kept moving forward without them. John's voice broke the silence again. "And then you find yourself here, talking to a cop, and wondering why you even bother. What's the point of it all?" The officer's mind raced. He had never thought about it this way. He had always been taught to follow the law, to do his job, and to never question orders. But now, looking at John, he felt a deep unease in his gut. What if John wasn't the person he seemed to be? What if he was just another man who had fallen through the cracks of society? What if stopping him on the street wasn't the right thing to do? Officer Daniels looked down at John's ID again. He could feel his heart pounding. What if this man had been forgotten by everyone around him, left to wander the streets alone, still fighting battles that no one could see? The officer thought about his own life, how easy it was for him to just go home, to have a warm meal and a place to sleep. But for John, life had never returned to normal. It never would. "I don't know what you want me to do," the officer said quietly. "I stopped you because you didn't look like you belonged here. I thought you were just another person I needed to check on. But now, I don't know." John nodded slowly, as if he understood the officer's confusion. "I'm not asking for your sympathy," he said. "I'm just trying to make sense of this world. But it's hard when the world doesn't care about you anymore." Officer Daniels was lost in thought. He had always believed in the rules, in keeping people safe and doing his job, no matter what. But now, standing in front of John, he felt like he was seeing everything through a new lens. He had been trained to follow the law, but was that all there was to it? Was that enough? What about the human side of things? What about the people who needed help, but couldn't ask for it? John turned to leave, his shoulders slumped, as if he had given up on ever being understood. But just as he took a step away, the officer spoke again. "Wait," Officer Daniels said, his voice firm but unsure. "I don't know what's right here. I don't know if I should just let you go, or if I should arrest you like I would anyone else. But I don't want to make the wrong choice." John stopped and turned back to the officer, his eyes searching the officer's face, as if he could see the doubt that had begun to grow inside him. "Sometimes, officer," John said quietly, "the hardest part is knowing what's right, when nothing feels right at all." The officer stood frozen, feeling more lost than ever. He had always thought he knew what to do in situations like this, but now he wasn't so sure. The doubt crept deeper into his mind, filling him with a sense of unease that wouldn't go away. The silence between Officer Daniels and John hung thick in the air, neither of them knowing what to say next. The officer's mind raced, and doubt twisted like a knot in his stomach. His whole career, his whole life had been about following rules, doing things the right way. But here he was, questioning everything he had been taught, standing face to face with a man who had lived through things no one should ever have to experience. John didn't say anything, but the weight of his words lingered in the air. His shoulders were slumped, his eyes tired. He looked like a man who had carried the world on his back for too long, and now he was just trying to keep going, one step at a time. But it wasn't just the world he was carrying. It was his past, his pain, and all the pieces of himself that had been shattered along the way. The officer looked down at the ground, his mind swirling. He had been trained to believe in the law, to believe that what was right and wrong was clear, cut and dry. But standing here now, in front of John, nothing seemed clear anymore. The lines between right and wrong blurred in a way that left him confused. "I don't know what to do, Mr. Turner," Officer Daniels finally said, his voice quiet but firm. "I don't know what's the right choice here. I don't know if I should just let you go, or if I should do my job and arrest you." John's face softened, and he gave a small shake of his head. "You don't have to arrest me," he said simply. "I'm not asking for anything. I just want to be left alone. But the truth is, no one ever really leaves you alone. The world just keeps spinning, while people like me get lost in it." For the first time, Officer Daniels felt something inside him shift. He had heard stories of soldiers returning home, of veterans who had a hard time adjusting, but he had never truly understood the depth of it until now. John wasn't just some stranger on the street. He was a man who had given everything, who had been through hell, and now he was standing here, lost and broken, just trying to survive in a world that didn't understand him. "I'm sorry," Officer Daniels said, the words coming out before he even realized he was speaking. "I didn't know. I didn't understand." John met his gaze, his eyes filled with something that could only be described as exhaustion. But there was also something else there, something that looked like relief, like he had finally found someone who was willing to listen, even if just for a moment. "It's not your fault," John said, his voice soft. "No one understands. Not unless they've been through it. But maybe that's the problem. Maybe the world's too busy with its own issues to see the ones who need help." The officer felt a pang of guilt in his chest. He had always been focused on doing his job, following the rules, but he had never once stopped to consider the lives behind the uniforms, the badges, the faces of the people he saw every day. He had never seen the brokenness behind the walls that people built around themselves, walls that hid the pain, the loss, the emptiness. "I'm sorry for what you've been through," Officer Daniels said, his voice full of sincerity. "I can't change the past, but I can see you now. I see you, Mr. Turner." John's face softened at the officer's words. There was a flicker of something in his eyes, maybe gratitude or maybe something deeper, something that spoke of a hope that had been buried for a long time. A hope that maybe, just maybe, someone cared. "You don't have to apologize," John said, shaking his head. "The past is the past. What matters is what we do with what's left." The officer took a deep breath, trying to steady his thoughts. He had come here to do his job, to enforce the law. But in that moment, he realized that there was more to his job than just following orders. There was humanity. There was understanding. There was compassion. And for the first time, Officer Daniels understood what it meant to truly see someone. To really see them for who they were, beyond the uniform, beyond the badge, beyond the rules. John Turner wasn't just a veteran. He was a man who had fought battles no one could see. And now he was just asking to be seen. "I'm not going to arrest you, Mr. Turner," Officer Daniels said finally, his voice steady and sure. "You're free to go." John nodded slowly, as if he had expected this answer all along. He didn't smile, but there was something in his eyes that said thank you without using words. He turned and walked away, his footsteps slow but steady, like he was carrying the weight of his past, but somehow just a little lighter than before. And as the officer watched him walk off into the distance, he felt a shift inside himself. He wasn't sure what the future held or how things would change, but he knew one thing for certain. In this moment, he had made the right choice. He had chosen to see John for who he really was, and in doing so, he had found something more important than following rules. He had found truth. The evening air was cooler now, and the streetlights cast long shadows across the sidewalk. Officer Daniels stood in the same spot where he had let John Turner go. His mind was still racing, but now there was a sense of calm that had settled over him. The weight of his decision was heavy, but it felt right. John had walked away without another word, his steps slow but steady. As the officer watched him disappear down the street, he couldn't help but wonder where he was going. Where did someone like John go after being seen, after being heard for the first time in so long? Was there a place for him in this world that could help him heal, or was he doomed to continue battling his inner demons alone? For a moment, Officer Daniels felt a deep sadness. He realized that John's struggle didn't end just because the officer had made a choice. The war wasn't over for John. It wasn't over for so many others. The officer's decision to let him go wasn't going to solve everything, but it had been a moment of understanding. A small gesture that had meant something, at least for that brief time. As he stood there, lost in thought, Daniels felt a hand on his shoulder. He turned to find his partner, Officer Ramirez, standing beside him. Ramirez was a no-nonsense kind of officer, always focused on doing things by the book. But tonight, something was different in his eyes. "You let him go, didn't you?" Ramirez asked quietly. Daniels nodded. "Yeah, I did." Ramirez raised an eyebrow, but didn't say anything right away. He simply stood there, watching the empty street where John had walked. The two men had been partners for years, and though they didn't always agree on everything, they had always had each other's backs. But tonight, Ramirez wasn't judging. He was just waiting, like he understood that sometimes the rules didn't apply in every situation. "Why?" Ramirez asked after a long pause. Daniels took a deep breath. He wasn't sure how to explain it, but he had to try. "I don't know, man. I've been doing this job for a long time, following orders, making arrests, doing what I'm supposed to do. But tonight, I realize there's more to it. There's more to people than just what's on the surface." Ramirez didn't interrupt. He just listened, his expression thoughtful. "John Turner wasn't just some guy on the street," Daniels continued. "He's been through things I'll never understand. And yeah, he might have made some bad choices, but I couldn't just treat him like a criminal. He's a man who's been broken by war, by things I can't even imagine. And for once, I saw him for who he really was." There was a moment of silence between them. Ramirez looked at his partner and then back down the street where John had disappeared. "You think you did the right thing?" Ramirez asked, his voice still calm, but now with a hint of curiosity. Daniels thought for a moment before answering. "I don't know if it was the right thing, but it felt like the human thing. Sometimes, it's not about following the rules to the letter. It's about doing what feels like it matters." Ramirez sighed, and then gave a small nod. "I get it. But you know, this job isn't easy. There are always going to be choices that don't have easy answers, and you're not always going to know if you made the right call until later. Daniels nodded in agreement. He knew Ramirez was right. This job, this life, it was full of tough calls. But for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like he had made a mistake. Maybe the law was black and white, but people were different. They were complicated. And in this case, he had chosen to see the complexity in John's story, to understand the things that couldn't be seen at first glance. Maybe we'll never know if we made the right call, Daniel said. But I'm okay with that. Ramirez gave him a long look, then finally gave a half smile. Well, if you're okay with it, then I guess I am too. Just remember, next time, we're both in this together. Daniel smiled back, feeling the weight of the decision lift just a little. I know. Thanks, partner. With that, the two officers turned and walked back toward their patrol car. The street was quiet now, and the night seemed to hold its breath. For a brief moment, everything felt still, like time had stopped, giving them a chance to think, to reflect, and to make a choice that wasn't about the law, but about something deeper. As they drove off into the night, Daniels couldn't help but wonder what would happen to John Turner. Would he find peace? Would he ever feel like he belonged again? It wasn't the officer's job to have those answers, but for now, he hoped that by simply listening, he had made a small difference in the life of a man who needed it most. The next morning, Officer Daniels couldn't shake the memory of the night before. He kept replaying the conversation with John Turner in his mind, thinking about the weight of what had happened. He had always thought of his job as black and white, right and wrong, law and order. But last night had shown him something different, something more complex. It had made him realize that sometimes the right decision wasn't about enforcing the law. It was about respecting the person in front of you. As he sat in his patrol car, sipping his coffee, his thoughts wandered to John. Where was he now? Did he find a place to sleep, or was he still wandering the streets, fighting the battles inside his head? Daniels didn't have the answers, but he couldn't help but feel a sense of respect for the man. John had faced so much, and yet he hadn't given up. He had kept going, one day at a time. Officer Daniels had always believed in doing his job with integrity, but what he had learned from John was that true integrity also meant seeing people for who they really were, not just for the mistakes they made or the label society put on them. He thought about the soldiers he had always admired, the ones who came home from war with scars no one could see. And now he understood them better. He understood why they struggled. As the day went on, Daniels went about his usual patrol, but something had changed in him. The job didn't feel the same. He saw the people on the streets differently. He noticed the tired eyes, the shoulders slumped from burdens no one could see. He started to wonder how many of them had stories like John's, stories of pain, of struggle, of fighting battles that never ended. Later that afternoon, Officer Daniels got a call about a minor disturbance at a nearby coffee shop. As he pulled up to the scene, he saw a group of people gathered around. His heart skipped a beat when he saw one of them, John Turner. John was sitting on the sidewalk, his back against the wall, his head down. He looked the same as the night before, but something about him was different now. There was a quiet strength in the way he sat, like he had made peace with something inside himself. Or maybe, just maybe, he had found a little bit of hope. Daniels hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to do. He had a duty to handle the situation, to ensure everything was calm. But something told him that John wasn't the problem here. He hadn't done anything wrong. In fact, the officer was starting to believe that the real issue wasn't John. It was the way society had forgotten about men like him, people who had given so much, only to be left behind once the war was over. He walked over to John slowly, not wanting to startle him. As he got closer, John looked up, and for a brief moment, their eyes met. There was no anger in John's eyes, no bitterness. There was just a quiet understanding, like he knew exactly who the officer was and what had happened between them.